Okay, everyone, buonasera a tutti e benvenuti. Can everyone hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. Great. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. The National Italian American Foundation thanks you for your continued support and commitment. What I love about hosting a virtual wine class for NIAF is that we're all on this Zoom call together with people from all over the United States in 3 different time zones. So regardless of where you live, it's officially time for a glass of vino. So feel free to start sipping and enjoying. I tend to talk a lot because there's so much I want to share with you. So please don't wait for me to speak about the wine specifically. You can just get started and enjoy. For those of you who haven't taken a wine class with me yet, you'll soon discover there's so much more to Italian wine than simply talking about flavors and aromas, although we will discuss that a little bit. This has really turned into not just a virtual wine class, but a meeting place for lovers of Italian culture from all over the US to get together and experience the story of Italian wine culture. And it's a story that goes back thousands of years, and it's still being written today, which is very exciting. So before we begin, if you have any questions along the way, you can post them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them as I go along. If I happen to miss anything, if we have some time at the very end, I'll do my best to answer all the questions, okay? So in the ancient world, the Italian peninsula was known as the land of wine, or Enotria in Italian. People traveled all over the Mediterranean by boat, by foot, by horse to taste the riches of the land. Pliny the Elder, a Roman author and naturalist, wrote about the abundance of wine grapes all over the Italian peninsula in this book, which is 2,000 years old. It's called Historia Naturalis, or Natural History. But what's interesting is that today, Italy is more known for its food than its wine. Let me prove it to you. So, trick question. Is Cabernet Sauvignon a grape or a wine? You can put it in the chat if you'd like. The answer is both. Cabernet Sauvignon is the name of a red grape that turns into Cabernet Sauvignon wine. The grape originates from France, so it's technically a native French grape. This is the most famous in the world today, and that's because places from France to Chile to Australia to California, everybody makes Cabernet Sauvignon, even the Italians. Also Pinot Noir, that's another popular wine. Like Cabernet, Pinot Noir turns into Pinot Noir. That's the name of the grape. And it also originates from France. And then you've got all of these other very familiar names like Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, all having French origins. These are the most popular wines today. And interestingly, none of them are exactly Italian. So you might say to me, Tony, what about Pinot Grigio? That's a very famous Italian white wine, right? And yes, the Italians have made Pinot Grigio famous throughout the world, but actually that's a French grape too. In France, it's called Pinot Gris. So if Italy was the land of wine in the ancient world, why does it seem like none of the world's most popular wines are authentic Italian today? You might say to me, Tony, hold on. Don't tell me you forgot about Chianti. And that's true. Chianti is authentically Italian, made predominantly with Sangiovese, a native Italian grape. But my question is, does one popular wine make Italy deserving of being called the land of wine today? Doesn't seem quite fair. Take Malbec, for example. It's the most popular wine from Argentina today, well known throughout the world. Why don't we call Argentina the land of wine? Historically, no one ever called it that. And also, Malbec is a native French grape originally. But in Italy's defense, they have Barolo, Barbaresco, Brunello di Montalcino, Amarone, arguably the best wines in the world. Fair enough. But you could just as easily say that about France. They have Bordeaux, Burgundy, Côte du Rhône, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, arguably the greatest wines in the world. So it makes you wonder, why didn't they just call France the land of wine? They obviously have many great wines, And there are great varieties of the most popular in the world today. And in fact, most of the world's collectible wines also French. Mysteriously, it was never called the land of wine either. So why was it called the land of wine? It's a big statement to call it that. And now it's known as the Chianti and of high-end wines. Would you like to know who called Italy the land of wine? I'll give you a clue. It was not the Italians. It was called the Italians the land of wine. They coined the phrase "Enotria," and they were the most advanced winemakers of the day. So if Italy's the land of wine, then you'd think the best wines in the world would be Italian wines. Naturally, they should be the most popular, the most known, most sought after. But instead, it's much supreme and top of mind. So tonight, I'll share with you what happened to Italy because it's a fascinating story. And so for some of you, this might be the first time you're taking one of my classes. I definitely see some familiar faces. Thanks for coming back. But I know there's some new faces here tonight and new people here tonight. So I just want to show you a quick story about how I got into wine and most importantly, discovered about wine that might give you some golden nuggets of knowledge that could be useful. So this is a picture of me with my father, Elio. And my father is from a small village in Montaquila in the Molise in southern Italy. A little over 20 years ago, my grandmother passed away, and it was the year that she died that we actually went on our first trip to Italy. My father had, we have like 50 cousins in this little town of about 1,000 people. Well, on that trip, I fell in love with Italy, and I continued to return every summer for 20 years. I immersed myself into the culture, the food, the wine. I ended up learning the language, mostly talking Italian in the kitchen with my aunt. It's usually the best way to learn. I would also take trips all over the country from north to south, and I was having these amazing food and wine. But when I'd come back home to New York, I'd to my liquor store on the upper to pick up Italian wine and reminisce in that most amazing. I was always disappointed. You know, the wines were never quite as good as what I was drinking in Italy, and it almost didn't matter how much money I spent. So I got curious about wine. I began studying wine. I took classes. I read books, and I learned a lot about wine. And yet, I still found this same phenomenon happening to me. I'd have fantastic tasting experiences in Italy, and then back home, I was disappointed. So has anyone ever had this experience in Italy that the wine seems to taste better than it does here? I'm going to do a quick poll, and all you have to do is click yes or no. Do Italian wines taste better while on vacation in Italy? Does anyone want to answer that? I'll launch it. Let's see what everybody says. This is always fun to see. Okay, looks like just about everybody participated that's here live. It's a 100% unanimous yes. The wines taste better while on vacation in Italy. Amazing. And so sometimes these wines that are so great in Italy happen to be as simple as just vino della casa that they serve in these carafes in the restaurants very inexpensively. And so I got curious about that as well. And when I'd be in a restaurant somewhere in Italy, I'd ask, know, the manager or the owner, whoever was in there, who made this wine? It's absolutely delicious. And they used to always tell me vaguely it was made by a local producer. They'd never tell me the name for some reason. Oh, getting some complaints about sound. Everyone, can everybody hear me? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Yeah, okay. Okay, good. Very good, very good. And so they never tell me the name, and and got me even more curious. Okay, but basically, these little local producers turn out to be smaller, lesser known vineyards, but super well respected in their local area. So I thought I was going to support these smaller vineyards for the rest of my life. And basically, these wines I find seem to do very well in international wine competitions, winning medals all around the world. And I even documented some of these discoveries about Italian wine and wrote this book called Hidden Gems of Italy. If you're curious, you can check it out on Amazon. So here's our agenda for the evening. Why the wine? Well, we know why the wines taste better a little bit on vacation in Italy. We'll get back into that in a little bit more. The one wine you should avoid at all costs, a red wine that claims to be the secret to longevity, two wines that were the favorites of Roman emperors, and then, of course, our wine pairing you already know, but we'll talk about those a little bit more. So let's go back to what happened to Italy. Does this picture look familiar? It's the city of Florence. This was the capital of the Italian Renaissance, which happened between the 14th and 16th century, and it was the height of Italian art, science, architecture, agriculture, and even wealth. This was the last time Italy was rich. And the period ended because of wars that were fought over who would control the peninsula. What were they fighting over? The riches and resources of the land. Italian people were so poor after these wars, they couldn't even afford basic equipment to farm on land. And so that's when you had your first massive wave of Italian emigration. Millions of Italians left Italy, many of whom were farmers from the south of Italy and came to the Americas. Around the same time this was happening, around the first immigration wave, something else crazy happened. An insect infested all the vineyards in Europe and destroyed most of them. The insect was called phylloxera. France was hit first historically by the phylloxera, and by the 1870s, 1880s, the French had already found the solution, which was planting American rootstock and regrafting their wines. It wouldn't be until after the fall of Mussolini that the Italians would begin revamping their wine industry. So the French were a decade ahead of the Italians in terms of bringing their wine industry back to life. A little bit smaller of immigration that actually my father was a part of that lasted up until the 1970s. Around the 60s or so, something interesting happened. Does this picture look familiar? This gallon jug of wine. This was very popular in the 60s and the 70s. And you can even find similar looking products on the shelf today under the names of Carlo Rossi, which actually happens to be a California wine and not an Italian wine. When the Italians started making wine after the fall of Mussolini, they were making a lot of wine, which is why they were shipping and exporting the wine in such large quantities. Now, vino da tavola, table wine, was not exactly a quality wine. And while northern regions like Piemonte and Tuscany were making fine wines around this time, most of Italy was producing table wines. It would be a few more decades, but we're now in a new period of quality wine coming out of all of Italy's 20 regions. There's an exciting new wine renaissance happening in Italy today. More and more world-class wines are coming out of Italy today that are virtually unheard of outside of their local areas. And the best part about these wines is that many of them can rival $50 bottles, $100 bottles of wine, an average, say, 20. So if you're a wine lover, I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time to be alive and to taste. There are two things that are contributing to this wine renaissance. native Italian grapes and small artisanal winemakers. So let's talk about the first thing. What are native Italian grapes? Well, they are very specific types of grapes that have been growing in the same place and pretty much under the same conditions for at least 1,000 years. And many of these native grapes for over 3,000 years. And because of this geological relationship between the grape, the climate, the soil, the wines that come from them have unique flavors, aromas, and textures that can't be duplicated. Most of these grape varieties have survived the ages in part because of the local people that cultivate them. So these wines are not just an agricultural product, but really a cultural product because they are expressions of the various local peoples throughout these 20 regions. This is a map of all the wine producing regions of the world. The orange areas are what we call Old World. The green areas what we call New World. There's an estimated, and this is only estimated, 8,000 different grape varieties used for winemaking throughout the world. Italy has an estimated 2,000. The little country of Italy, the size of Arizona, has about a quarter of all the world's wine grapes. And that's because Italy is uniquely located in the perfect place on planet Earth, right smack in the middle of the Mediterranean. So here's a map of Italy. These are all the 20 regions. You can think of them as 20 states if you'd like. And each one of them has their own unique local wines or native wines, if you like to call it that. So this evening, we're going to explore 5 different regions. We're going to start off with our white wine in Sicily, and then we're going to go to Lazio for our first red, then back down to Campania in the south, and then after Sardinia, and then finish the evening with the bottle swap option in the Piemonte. The one wine to avoid at all costs. The old saying, a picture can tell 1,000 words, still holds true. Okay, on the right-hand side, you have a machine harvesting the grapes in a vineyard, and on the left-hand side, you have a person hand harvesting, hand selecting the grapes. You can't make a lot of wine when you're hand selecting, but the quality of the final wine made is much higher. So that's why, you know, we're basically trying to put parameters around what is a small artisan winemaker. And you could say somewhere around 50,000 bottles a year, whereas a mass producer who machine harvests can make millions of bottles a year and make them all consistently drinkable because of all the technology that happens in the cellar. Very hard to find these pictures, by the way, of these tractors doing the machine harvest, but they're picking everything: the ripe, the unripe, the sour, the rotten, even the insects. That's all getting picked up in this mass industrial form of harvesting. And unfortunately, the majority of the wines in our wine shops are coming from places like these and ways like these. A machine might be able to harvest more grapes than human hands, but wine itself is not a machine. It's a living, breathing drink, and it's best made with human hands. Okay, we're ready to start talking about our first wine. Does anybody have the white wine open tonight by chance? By the way, I see a lot of people are off camera. Wine's a social drink. Hop on the camera. Feel free to share. You know, that's what we're here for. We're all friends. We're all friends. Hey, there we go. Yeah, join us. Don't be shy. We're all friends here. We're all interested in Italian culture. Probably most of us have our bloodlines coming from there, from one part of the family or the other. And so anyway, I can't think of a better way of making new friends than over a glass of wine. So, and also I feed off your reactions. Nobody likes to talk to a wall. So our first white wine tonight is made with Catarratto. So we're virtually going to fly to Sicily. It's a triangular island, and it's the southernmost region of Italy. You know, today, Sicily's famous for a lot of things like cannoli, eggplant parmesan, and dare I say, the Godfather movies, of course. Some people call Sicily its own continent, and that's because in Sicily, you have everything that you need for a quality life. And while they do import some goods to the island, the truth is Sicily has everything it needs. It has oranges, almonds, pistachios, tomatoes, fish, wheat, cheese, meat. They've got it all. And of course, they have wine. So Sicily's very rich in resources. We are specifically going to go to a mountain range in north central Sicily called the Madonie Mountains. It's about a half-hour drive outside of Palermo and about another hour's drive to get up the mountain. Okay. These are the highest mountains in Sicily after Mount Etna, the volcano, the famous volcano. The difference between these two mountains, which both produce a lot of good wine, is that there's no volcano at the top of the Madonie. And so I'm actually going to be taking you to a vineyard, which is the highest in all of Sicily. And this is the Castel Lucimiano Estate Vineyards, truly in a world of its own. As you can see here in Valle d'Olmo, Sicilia, there's no sign of civilization in sight. And when you don't have people in sight, you don't have pollution. So the soils are good, clean, uncontaminated. The vineyards rest between 1,500 and 3,000 feet above sea level, making it the highest vineyards in Sicily. That's just another picture of a wine map to show you where we are in that orange section there. And this is our first white wine. It's the Castellucci Miano. They nicknamed the bottle Miano Bianco, and it's made with 100% Catarratto. So it's not Sauvignon Blanc, it's not Pinot Grigio, it's not Chardonnay, it's Catarratto. And this grape uniquely only grows in Sicily. And you will find it all over the island. And you will also experience different results from one vineyard to the other, depending on the location. You will find Catarratto also at Mount Etna, but you will also find it in the Madonie Mountains, especially. What does this wine taste like? It's a medium-bodied wine. It's got a buttery texture, which is interesting because there's no oak aging on this at all. It aged in steel vats only. So there's what you're tasting is the real variety of Catarratto. The wine is extremely aromatic. If you haven't tasted it yet, and you swirl the wine in your glass, and you smell the aroma that explodes out of your glass from this wine, you will know instantly before tasting it that you're going to like the wine. It's got beautiful perfumes, hints of citrus notes. There's some apple, and what I find to be one of the more interesting parts of it is that there's almost like a salty finish, which is interesting because it's capturing the salty sea air of the Mediterranean up in those mountains. It's really fascinating because the wine is like literally transporting you to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, I've had this wine at 10 years old too, by the way. This wine actually has the ability to age because it has very high acidity. And that high acidity is that crispness that you get on the finish that makes the wine so exciting to taste. But it's that salty finish that just keeps making you go back for more and more sips. Catarratto at the Castellucci Miano Vineyards grows on a special vine, a short 3-foot-high vine that they call alberello, which means little tree in Italian. The Romans discovered thousands of years ago that you could produce higher quality wine grapes by growing on these little tree vines. And notice there are only 2 clusters of grapes on each vine. This is a picture of one of the Miano vineyards in the springtime as the vines are budding. And then this is later on when the canopies grow. And the canopies are there to protect the white grapes from the hot sun and give them shade. Too much direct sunlight is not good, especially for white grapes. Beautiful. This is one of my favorite pasta dishes, spaghetti ai gamberi e zucchine. The zucchini and the shrimp really go well together. Throw in a little bit of garlic in that, some olive oil. We're talking about 4 ingredients, super simple, super easy to make, and it goes great with the Castellucci Bianco. Anything with shellfish and the Miano go really well together. They complement each other because of that saltiness that they have in common. But you could also just as easily pair it with a fleshier fish. In this case, this was a baked cod. Throw some olive oil on it, some parsley, salt, pepper, some lemon, put it in the oven for whatever, 20, 30 minutes. I also sauteed some broccoli rabe, very Italian, broccoli rabe, right? That bitterness, for those of you who don't like bitterness, for that reason, you don't eat broccoli rabe because it's bitter, try it with the Miano, because you're going to have that bitterness in your mouth, and then you're going to go for that sip from the Miano. It's got all those ripe citrus and stone fruits, and it creates this beautiful contrast on the palate. Try it and let me know what you think. So that's our white wine for the evening. Our next wine is the first red of the evening, Cesenese del Piglio. The wine type is named after a red grape called Cesenese and the city from which it comes from, which is Piglio. So the typology translates the Cesenese grape from Piglio. We're going to go to south central Italy, to the region of Lazio. Now, there's not one single picture that I could find that could capture the essence of this region, which is densely rich in history and culture. It's a south central region bordering the Tyrrhenian Sea. So on the coast, there's the famous ancient port of Ostia. It still retains mosaics and a theater. But then inland, there's the Apennine Mountains, which you can see in the background here in this picture. There are nature reserves, there are lakes, and there are stone-built villas all over the region, like this one in this picture here. Civita di Bagnoregio is the name of this ancient village made of stone. So we're going to, just to get a sense of place. The principal city of Lazio is Roma, Italy's capital, and was at the heart of the ancient Roman Empire. It was once called Caput Mundi, which in Latin translates to capital of the world. And its iconic ruins like the Colosseum and the Roman Forum continue to whisper this message even today. Just 30 miles southeast of Rome is an ancient city called Piglio. It's located in the province of Frosinone. Piglio is the cradle of Cesenese wines. It's an ancient city with medieval architecture that seems to cling with its nails to this rocky mountain called Monte Scalambra. Historically, there were many admirers of Cesenese wines in the area, including the Emperor Nerva himself, who, according to tradition, was impressed by the landscape and the quality of the wine. So he had built one of the imperial palaces in Piglio to be near the vineyards, the remains of which are still visible. Hundreds and hundreds of years later, in the Middle Ages, Cesenese was one of the favorite wines of the popes. Here's an up-close map of Lazio. And if you look closely, there's a small yellow shaded area with a little red circle inside of it. That tiny yellow area is the only place where this wine can be made. Both the vineyards and the cellar must produce and bottle the wine in that area. And so the DOCG is the Italian classification system that controls and checks this wine with a stamp of authenticity. this tiny area ensures that the traditions and the character of this wine are expressed with a unique identity from Pidio. And so the vineyards of the Terre Antiche estate are found in the municipalities of Pidio and a height of about 1,000 feet, 1,000 feet above sea level. They're located at the foot of the Ernici Mountains in an uncontaminated natural environment, just like the Madonie Mountains in Sicily. This mix of vineyards, divided into several parcels, gave rise to producing single cru wines, wines from specific vineyards arranged on different terrains in terms of formation of the soils and the sun exposures, so that the resulting wines represent a pure expression of an individual vineyard. They do practice biodynamic farming, which focuses heavily on maintaining the vitality of the soils and form the basis of a path towards quality wines. And so the grapes are born through this harmonious relationship between plant and soil. And so after the grapes are harvested, they are uniquely prepared for spontaneous fermentation on their native yeast, and they're aged in these concrete vats. This is not a new thing, by the way. My father and his family used to make wine in the 1960s in these concrete vats. There's a long tradition, particularly in the south of Italy, but also in the north, of doing it because it's for many, many reasons. It's a traditional container, and it allows the wine to develop its aromas, flavors, and textures without the influence of oak. So what you're tasting is a pure, raw wine of the highest quality. Now, there's a wide range of styles coming from these Cesenese wines. The Terra Antica Rubino, the one that we sent you this evening, is a very young, very fresh, and vibrant version of this wine. Many of the other versions tend to be, shall I say, a bit rustic, to say the very least. Now, you might have noticed the clear glass bottle that it comes in. Don't let it fool you. It is not a rosé. This is a dry red wine. There's no reason for the clear glass bottle other than it was an aesthetic decision. The ruby red color of this wine is gorgeous, by the way, and that's why they call the wine Rubino as a nickname, which means the little ruby. Gorgeous color, top single vineyard cru Cesenese grapes. And they only produce 9,000 bottles annually of this wine, and we sent you the 2020. What does it taste like? Medium plus bodied, with bright and fresh red cherry notes, and even a lot of red floral notes. The texture is silky smooth, and what I think makes the wine most interesting is its complex finish, loaded with compact material from the terrain. A little bit earthy, savory, very satisfying, very complex, and it's not in your face. It's subtle, just enough to keep the wine interesting. And so again, there's no wood contact, and the wine is expressing a crystal clear impression of the perfumes and flavors of this vineyard in Pidio. I'll also note that if you didn't open it up earlier, after about an hour of this wine breathing, it will get fuller bodied. You'll get more bouquet, more aromatics, and the structure of the wine sort of comes together very nicely. It actually gets smoother and smoother as it's breathing. Now, this wine is quite versatile, and it can pair with a whole host of different foods, from pastas to meat dishes. But tonight I thought it would be fun to go with a local dish from Lazio, something that we might not think of to make, and I sent you all the recipe. I recommend you try it sometime. You can never go wrong pairing a local Italian dish with its local wine. You can never make a mistake. And so today we went with a Roman dish called polenta e fagioli. And for those of you who have never seen polenta before, it's made from corn, and it's very popular, particularly in northern Italy, but also around parts of Rome. And there's so many dishes that you can do with it. There's so many things. It's very versatile. And it's also meatless for those of you who are looking for a meatless night. I would sprinkle some Margiotta Reggiano on top of this. You don't see it in the picture, but that would be fantastic. Okay, Campi Taurasini, our next red wine. This is made with a native grape called Aglianico, which we'll talk more about in a second. So now we're going to move further south again, leaving Lazio and going down to neighboring Campania. Now, historically, Campania was an important part of the Roman Republic 2,000 years ago because of its rich pastures and valuable countrysides. It was the epicenter of Greco-Roman culture, where Greek language and customs intertwined with Roman culture and life. Some famous cities in Campania are Naples and Pompeii, which was destroyed by the volcano Mount Vesuvius, that you can also see in the backdrop of this photograph. This is from the vantage point of the Amalfi Coast, with Mount Vesuvius in the background. And this is one of the few regions that in Italy historically did not transition to the French grape varieties. So in Campania, it would be almost impossible to find a Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot or they are deeply attached to their customs and traditions, and of course their wines and the grape varieties that make them. We're going to go inland in Campania, about an hour and 40 minutes from the Amalfi Coast, to a town, a medieval town called Taurasi. And the wine that we're about to talk about, or shall I say, the main red grape variety in Taurasi, in Campania for that matter, is Aglianico. You only learn one grape from Campania, this would be the one. Aglianico was one of the favorites of Emperor Augustus some 2,000 years ago. This is our second emperor now on record of enjoying another grape variety. Now, the story behind his wife Livia, who apparently an avid lover, and the emperor to export Aglianico to the southern provinces. That's why today Aglianico-based wines can be found in all the southern regions of Italy, from Lazio and downward. But they say its spiritual home is in Taurasi, where the story began. Taurasi is an ancient village that traces its history back to pre-Roman times, but today it maintains its architecture from that medieval period. Its name derives from the Taurus, because that was one of the gods the Saniti tribe that ruled the area at the time used to worship. This was the tribe that controlled the area before the Romans came. Aglianico actually comes from Latin word Ellenico, and in Latin, Ellenico means Greek. And so therefore, historically, Aglianico means the Greek grape. And as I mentioned before, Campania was the heart of Greco-Roman culture. And since the Romans had great respect for Greek culture, they believed that Aglianico was brought to Italy from Greece. We have no record of that, and Aglianico does not exist in modern-day Greece. So today, it's believed to be a native grape of Campania. This is Raffaele Inglese. He's the owner and winemaker of Antico Borgo, a micro producer in Taurasi. And right, so he doesn't speak English, even though that's his last name. So it's just kind of ironic. And so he's hugging one of the oldest vines in Italy, 260 years old. I am told that It doesn't produce quality wine grapes to make wine anymore, but it just goes to show the historical length of winemaking in the region. So this is our second red wine of the evening. This is the Antico Borgo Campi Taurasini. Now, Campi Taurasini is a type of wine. It literally means the Taurasi fields, but it's 100% Aglianico. Now, Aglianico can produce age-worthy wines, and it has the ability to age decades in the bottle. This is not true for all of the Aglianico wines in the other southern regions that I mentioned earlier. So it's really in Taurasi where Aglianico appears to have the longest aging potential. And in fact, this is the oldest wine we're tasting this evening, the 2017. The vineyard is located in Taurasi. I'm even going to show you a short video of it. And this is the current vintage. The 2018 will be out sometime this year. Does anyone have it open tonight? Just curious. Just give me a thumbs up. Great. So, full-bodied wine. It's bold. It's intense. It makes no excuses. It's got a long finish. It's got lots of dark cherry notes. Has some rose petals, which I pick up a little bit more in the aromatics, more so than in the taste. There are spices. There's earth notes. There's ash. These savory earth notes that you really kind of taste more on the finish than anywhere else come from the millions of years old volcanic soils that the vines grow in. So decanting this wine will really open it up, and it'll get even further fuller bodied. The perfumes will intensify. The textures will sort of soften, and you'll get even more fruit if you let it breathe. And in fact, if you just happen to finish half the bottle tonight, the second half tomorrow, I guarantee will taste even better because it'll continue to breathe and open up. The wine's age-worthy for 15 to 20 years. Mamma mia, that looks good. Paccheri al ragù napoletano con le bracciole. This is making me hungry, this picture. This is, shall we say, the meat and potatoes of Italian food and wine together. Pasta with a rich red meat sauce made with tomato, and le bracciole, which, if any of your relatives come from Neapolitan origins, like maybe you had a grandparent, they probably didn't call it le bracciole. They called it braciole. They called it braciole or braciole, depending, using the dialect word. So hardcore Southern Italian, rich, complex dish, lots of flavors, lots of fat, cheese, tomato, basil, probably some parsley in the meat. Very complex. You need a super powerful, complex wine to sort of balance it all out. And look at the deep, rich red color of Aglianico. So I'm going to take you into the Taurasi vineyard with Raffaele right now, just to take a little sneak peek into the vineyard and see. We're about 1,100 feet above sea level here. This is like early September. We're still about 3 weeks out before the harvest, but at least the grapes have gotten their red pigment at this point. And you can see Raffaele, he's going to remove some of the canopy, not because he wants to show you the grape necessarily, but because he's going to do that to the entire vineyard in the up and coming days to give more sun exposure for the final weeks to make sure the sugar levels reach the proper levels for harvest. Aglianico, the Roman emperor's grape. And of course, it's a family operation. Everybody participates in the harvest. Even Nonna, grandma, participates as well. Of course, just scissors and hands. If you're really curious, and you want to go a little bit deeper, I do have a documentary that I filmed in Taurasi. You can see more of that video on my YouTube channel. It's called The Emperor's Wine. You just go to Gladiator Wine TV and you can watch it anytime. Okay, let's go to our third red wine of the evening, and that is Cannulari. This may be the rarest of all of our wines this evening. So we're going to go to Sardinia, the second largest island in Italy after Sicily, and it's one of Italy's 20 regions. It's been a fascinating place for geologists because apparently it has these tectonic plates below the island that are not connected to continental Europe, which sort of makes it its own microcontinent of its own, physically speaking. It's also a very safe place, meaning that it's not prone to earthquakes because of these tectonic plates. Sardinia also has some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. Just got a question. Do you plan on doing a tasting of Primitivo? I don't think I'm going to do one this year, but I am going to reveal to you the next class that's coming up. And I think everyone's going to be excited about that. But anyway, Sardinia has been populated since Neolithic times and has been home to many different cultures ever since. And you can see evidence of this, of these successive layers of history all over the island, like in this picture. What you're looking at here is what's called a nuraghe. It's a small archaeological site, a little village that was built during what they call the Nuragic civilization between 3,000 and 8,000 years ago. And it's believed that winemaking on the island can be traced back to this period, making it the oldest wine culture in the Mediterranean. We're specifically on the island going to an old village, to say the least, old, called Usini, small village of about 4,000 people. It's considered a city of wine and part of a national association of other participating cities in Italy that have a long history of winemaking and want to protect the integrity of the wines as well as the surrounding environment. And so it's sort of like the UNESCO heritage site, but for wine. And this is super important when it comes to Italian wine, because Italian wine is completely attached to the origin from which it comes from. So this wine that you have cannot be made anywhere else but in Usini. There are only 9 commercial wineries in this ancient city, and they cultivate a red grape called Cannulari. Outside of the city of Usini, you'll find a place called Selige and Tosu. It's a necropolis, a place of burial that prehistoric people cut through rock and built tombs for groups of deceased people in here. This necropolis dates back to the late Neolithic age, somewhere around 5,500 years ago. Why am I showing you this? Because inside the necropolis, scientists found the remnants of wooden twigs that were used to make a fire, probably some type of burial ritual that incorporated the use of fire. And when the twigs were analyzed, they discovered that the twigs were grape stems, and not just any grape stems, but they were Vitis vinifera, which is the species of grapevines that all our wines come from today. It was originally thought that foreign settlers brought grapevines and winemaking to Sardinia, but these twigs predate any settlements, which means that winemaking and the domestication of grapevines was already happening in Sardinia. Fast forward a few thousand years, and you'll see that winemaking in Usini historically has always been a way of life there, so much so that the wine cellar was usually built inside people's homes. The wine cellar was the first room of the house when you go through the entrance. Notice the wide curves on the left and right sides. Those were carved out later when aging wine in barrels became fashionable, and they had to carve out space so that they could get the barrel inside. Before that, they were aging the wine in concrete vats. And so, like I said, there are only 9 commercial wineries in Uzini. I've been traveling to this town almost every summer since 2017. I'm a bit fascinated by this place and tasting all the local wines. And one producer really stood out to me, and his name is Francesco Fiori. He's a native of Uzini, and he spent his entire life cultivating Cagnolotti wines. Cagnolotti vines. The first time he grafted a vine was when he was 13 years old, which, as I'm told, is a pretty young age and usually requires a more experienced person to do that kind of job. So you can kind of think of him as a prodigy in the vineyard. He's an artisanal winemaker. He learned the trade not in school, but with mentors and through trial and error. He also happens to be a natural winemaker, and his Cagnolotti wines were made with native yeast and spontaneous fermentation. No additives whatsoever in his wines. Again, pure raw wine. He's been making it pretty much the same way for the last 40 years. Obviously trying to perfect it along the way. What is this Cagnolotti grape that the locals are so dedicated to? It's a native grape on the island of Sardinia. It's one of the most ancient grapes of the island, tracing its history all the way back to wild vines. So tasting Cagnolotti is like tasting the ancient past. It also happens to be it has some of the highest levels of antioxidants of any wine grape in Sardinia and probably the world. Its antioxidant levels were documented in this book called Vitigni di Sardegna, or Vines of Sardinia. And as it turns out, this grape has even more antioxidant levels than the Cannonau that the island is very famous for. They call it one of the blue zone wines. People live to be 100 because they drink the Cannonau wines. But apparently Cagnolotti has even more antioxidant content, which is interesting. So, they say when you drink Cagnolotti, or, maybe you'll live 100 years. There's only one way to find out, right? Historically, the grape was always used for blends because of its dark red pigments and its high alcohol and high acid. It makes a great grape for spicing up a boring wine. But in Uzini, Cagnolotti is the most coveted grape, and it's produced as a monovarietal there. So no blending with other grapes, so you can taste the essence of this historical grape. So I just want to take you inside a Cagnolotti vineyard in Uzini while Francesco squeezes the juice out of one of the grapes. I want you to see this, because this is quite interesting. So he's going to pull a grape off one of the clusters in just a second. And I want you to notice the juice that comes out of the grape. The juice is red already as soon as they squeeze the grape. Now, most domesticated wine grapes today, when you do that in the vineyard, the juice comes out white or clear. Okay? And that physiological phenomenon there means that Cagnolotti is an ancient grape and very, very closely related to the wild vine. And in fact, there are more wild vines in Sardinia than any other place in the world. So scientists are able to study the pathway from making wine from wild vines to later on domesticating the grapes so that they could produce quality wines repeatedly every year. And the grapes are delicious, by the way. I got to taste one. The grape, as soon as I tasted it, it literally already tasted like wine to me, without the alcohol, of course. So here's the vineyard where the wine we sent you comes from. This vineyard's called Serra Ualis, and it's written right on the front label. This is the name of the hill with this vineyard sitting on it. The vineyards contain the oldest vines of Francesco's estate, which are over 70 years old. These vines were planted by Francesco's father So you can imagine what he must feel like every time he comes here. His father is gone, but his vines live on. Unfortunately, we missed the harvest for this vineyard, so you won't see any grapes on the vines. But as you can see, again, like in Sicily, the little Albarello vines making high quality grapes. After the grapes are hand harvested, they're put in these crates and taken back to the cellar. And Francesco personally presses these grapes manually without any machinery. Very traditional, very old world. And then the wine ages in these steel vats behind me in this picture. So there's no oak on this. And this wine is super rich, super highly concentrated. You would think that it aged in oak barrels, but it didn't, and it doesn't need it. And there's so much detail in the nuances of the flavors of this wine that he chose not to age the wine in oak because it would cover up those nuanced details. Just 6,000 bottles a year made annually. You could drive right up to his winery and bring a empty glass bottle, and he'll fill it up for you. And in the summers when I go there, I'll go and pick up 5 to 10 liters at a time, and it comes right out of the steel vat, and it's so fresh and so alive that the wine doesn't go bad after a week of it being open. You continue drinking it, and it's fantastic even after a week. There are no preservatives. It's just, I call it the antioxidant elixir. So besides the acidity and tannins that all the wine professionals talk about, which contributes to longevity, I think there's something going on with these antioxidant contents that slow down the process of the wine dying. So because of Cagnolotti's big power and dense richness, I paired it with pork sausage with some French fries and the salad to sort of round it out, make it a little healthier with the salad part. Cerejuelas goes really well with very rich, fatty, meaty dishes like pork or lamb or hard aged cheeses or a meat sauce with the pasta. Am I making everybody hungry? So Cerejuelas has what I would call more like blackberry type notes of flavors. There's some spices, and there's a very interesting earthy and savory finish. It's super unique to the terrain of this ancient place with this ancient wine. Well, I'm asking. Someone asked me if I would do a grappa tasting. That would be a lot of fun. I am a fan of grappa, by the way. I love grappa. I tend to only drink it in the winter months when it's cold. I had a grappa di Amarone the other day that I was sharing with my father. But some of the wineries do make grappa, but I don't think any of the ones that I've talked about this evening. So anyway, something maybe to do in the future. Okay, here's our last wine for the evening, and this was the bottle swap option that many of you took the offer, and it's in the Piemonte region. So we're going to end our Italian trip up in the northwest of Italy. Now, Piemonte shares its northern border with France. How did they decide on where the border would be? And the answer is the snowy covered Alps form the border between Piemonte and France. Piemonte translates to the foot of the mountain. And so I think that this picture really encapsulates the meaning of Piemonte, being at the foot of the mountain, talking about the Alps, the rolling, colorful hills with the villages on them, surrounded by the dominating snowy covered Alps. Let's zoom in a little bit on Piemonte. Now, Barbaresco is not a grape. It's a township, which you can see in the orange section in Piemonte. and it's also a specific winemaking area comprised of a few other communes surrounding Barbaresco. It's commonly compared to Barolo. Some people call Barolo the king of wines and Barbaresco the queen of wines. Maybe I'll give you a little bit more insight as to why they do that. Like Barolo, Barbaresco is considered one of the world's greatest wines. It's found in the cellars of wine collectors throughout the world. And part of the secret to Barbaresco wine becoming one of the world's best can be found in this picture. As beautiful as this picture is, you might be curious to know, why would anyone plant a vineyard on a steep hill like this? Wouldn't that be tougher on the legs and knees to work the land? Absolutely. It's hard work, it's tough, but it's totally worth it. With this photo, I wanted to illustrate the importance of vineyards located on slopes, just like in Taurasi, and even in Serralloales to a certain extent. It's one of the key ingredients to producing quality wine grapes. It's been known for centuries that vines grown on slopes get better sun exposures so that the grapes can mature properly. And it also sends excess water away from the vines, because red wine grapes in general do not like too much water, because it dilutes the complexity and the polyphenolic material found in the grapes. Also, starving the roots a little bit will cause them to continue to grow, because a vine is a weed after all, and it always wants to keep growing in search of water. And this action of digging deeper into the soils ends up producing higher quality wine grapes. Just another picture of Italy here, where you can find Barbaresco. This is, again, another map of Piemonte. This is with all the subregions in the area. And the gray area, with the arrow pointing to it, is the only area in the Piemonte where you can make Barbaresco wine. Both the vineyard and the wine cellar must be in Barbaresco, in one of these communes. And as you can see, it's much smaller than Barolo. Barolo down here is the red section. It's a smaller area, it's a smaller production zone, and it's sort of shaped like a croissant, Barbaresco. The borders have remained unchanged for decades, which is different from Barolo, by the way. And they take the territory of about 4 different townships. Barolo has 11 townships. And so the wine that we're going to taste this evening comes from one of those townships called Neive. Not all vineyards in Barbaresco are created equal either, by the way. There are certain micro zones that are known to produce better quality grapes than others. One such area is called Serragrilli in Neive. So we keep zooming in closer and closer and closer. We started off with Piemonte, then we looked at Barbaresco. Now inside Barbaresco, the zone, there's Neive, and inside the township of Neive, there's this hill called Serragrilli. Okay, this is one of the, you could call it a fraction of, it's one of those little villages inside the greater township of Neive. And so this is one of the cru terrains for Barbaresco, where some of the finest Nebbiolo grapes come from. Now, right up here on the top of Serragrilli, that's circled in red, is the Battaglio vineyard, which is the wine that comes from this little tiny parcel at the top of the hill. This is Gianluca Battaglio, overlooking his vineyards. He's not just the owner of his family's estate, he's also the winemaker, and he also gets his hands dirty and works in the vineyard cultivating the vines. So I'm going to share with you a picture in Serragrilli, in Barbaresco, of his family doing the harvest. And there are only 5 of them. Only 5 people do the harvest.
Saluta un po', papà. Jeff, Saluta. Che ne vai?
Gianluca's telling them to say hi to the camera.
Sentire sento, certo.
It's a windy day in Barbaresco.
Esa fue.
And so Barbaresco wines are made with 100% Nebbiolo grapes. Now, Nebbiolo is thought to derive its name from the Italian word nebbia, which means fog. And it's no coincidence that the Nebbiolo vineyards of Barbaresco can occasionally experience foggy weather. In some vintages, it can be a real problem when there's too much fog because it prevents the grapes from maturing properly because the sun is blocked for too long, which leads us to another secret about the small artisan winemaker. They can see with their own eyes which grapes are developing properly and which ones are not. So if the climate is not particularly good that year, they will still make great wine, but just less of it because they will salvage the best grapes. Can't do that with machinery. So after a hand harvest of Nebbiolo grapes on the Serragrilli Hill, the grapes are separated by sections in that tiny parcel. And each section of grapes gets their own barrel to age in for 2 years. Gianluca practices a winemaking technique called assemblaggio, or the assembly. It's the blending of different barrels to make the wine. And Gianluca, I think, has become quite a master of this technique. And that's why he's won gold medals at the Merano Wine Hunter competition in Italy, which is sort of like the Olympics of wine in Italy. It's a great achievement. Now, the Barbaresco, which we sent you for the evening, reaches maturity after 2 years of aging in wood, in oak. It's usually 80% French barrique. No, sorry, it's 80% Slavonian oak and 20% French barrique. And his barrels are neutral, meaning the wine doesn't absorb any flavor from the oak, like vanilla or smoke, which a lot of wineries do. Because he also, like many producers today, small artisan producers, they want to show off the nuanced details of the grape, in this case, Nebbiolo. The life of the wine varies from 15 to 20 years or more, depending on the vintage. The scents are intense, they're persistent. There's a clear hint of red fruits, rose hips, spices. On the finish, there's more red cherry, some almond, and sort of like seed notes, which are coming from the tannins. But it's very interesting. One difference I will also point out is that between Barolo and Barbaresco is that Barbaresco wines tend to be ready to drink earlier in terms of age. And in fact, the Battaglio 2019 that we sent you, I find to be ready for drinking right now. It's so fresh, so fragrant and smooth. While it certainly has aging potential, it can be enjoyed right now. And these types of wines can be very tannic at a young age. Barbaresco wines can be very tannic, but I don't find this wine to be tannic at all. The tannins are there, but they're so fine and they're so integrated into this wine. It's as if like they're hidden under a pillow made of silk. So decanting for an hour or two is ideal, but I've even had this wine just popping the cork and pouring, and I'm happy. I'm very happy with it. So it's a great achievement, I think, from Gianluca. He only produced about 980 bottles of this. I mean, this is a micro batch. I mean, this is like, this guy's wine is the salt of the earth. I mean, wine just doesn't get any purer than this. Guy, only family members participating in the harvest, and they do a lot of work for a very small amount of really, really special wine. One of the other characteristics of this wine you might notice is that it feels a little bit light when it hits your palate, and you get this bright, ripe, mature red fruits. It's very soft, very welcoming, and then on the finish it explodes, and all of a sudden it's this big, full-bodied wine. I mean, it's really, really intriguing. When you drink those California Cabernets, it's like it feels like a milkshake is like touching your lips as soon as you go for that first sip. It's just like big, thick, and heavy. This has so much more detail than something like that, Pairing, you can never go wrong with mushroom-based dishes or truffle-based dishes with Barbaresco. And so this dish happens to have both risotto ai porcini e tartufo. You know, the black truffles tend to be much more affordable than the infamous white truffle, which also comes from Piemonte. I think the last time I checked, it was like $5,000 a pound. But if anyone needs a recommendation for black truffles, let me know, and I can refer you to somebody that I get my black truffles from. And so the small artisan vineyards represent the best of what hardworking hands can provide us. You know, also family, community play a crucial role making these kinds of wines possible. And so I'd argue there's more in a great bottle of wine than just delicious flavors. It's also the places and the people that make it possible. And so the biggest takeaway I hope that we've learned this evening with this new Italian wine renaissance is that the Greeks were right, and they're still right. Italy is the land of wine, Enotria. It's the greatest wine producing country in the world because there's more biodiversity, more grape varieties, more opportunities to explore unique wines than any other country in the world. And there's more potential still for making the world's best wines than any other place in the world. And so your next favorite wine, for sure, if you keep exploring, is waiting for you somewhere on that peninsula. And maybe you found one tonight. Coming up next month, March 10th, I'll be taking you on a virtual journey through the region of Tuscany and focusing in on the wines of Montalcino specifically. We're going to talk about Brunello di Montalcino, Rosso di Montalcino. We'll even talk about Super Tuscans. This will be the first time I'll be going in depth on probably Italy's most popular wine region. And some of the stories and discoveries I'll be sharing with you about Tuscany, you're never going to hear anywhere else. So I hope to see you in about a month. I'd like to thank the National Italian American Foundation for inviting me again to do this wine class. I want to thank you all for participating and supporting the foundation, supporting small artisan winemakers in Italy. If you need to get more wines, you can go to these links that I have there. I can also put them in the chat. You can also email me anytime if you have any questions or you need help picking some wines. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Sorry about the little hiccup with the Wi-Fi earlier, but I hope to see you again soon, okay? Everyone have a great evening. Buona serata e buonanotte.
Buonanotte. Il vino Veritas.
Il
Thank
vino
you.
Veritas.
Grazie mille.
Grazie mille. Ciao.
Grazie a tutti.
Grazie mille.
Grazie a tutti.
Ci vediamo.